Hello, this is Chef John from foodwishes.com with Amish Beef and Noodles. That's right, as a little kid I always got excited when I heard the grown-ups talking about traveling to Amish country, since I knew that meant they'd be bringing back all kinds of amazing pies and breads. But what I wish they had brought back is this. And if you're looking for a bowl of comforting, satisfying goodness, this should be the next thing you make. And to get started, we'll cut up some beef chuck, which comes from the shoulder and is perfect because it has lots of connective tissue, which makes it perfect for braising and stewing. And what we'll do is cut this up into pieces, ideally somewhere between 1 and 2 inches in size. All right, you pick, but no matter the exact size, try to get them as uniform as you can. And we definitely don't have to trim the fat off, but if I do get to a large solid piece of fat, I generally will remove it. But I would probably err on the side of not trimming enough versus trimming too much. And once our beef is cut up, we'll go ahead and season it by sprinkling over a mixture of kosher salt and some freshly ground black pepper. And we'll give that a thorough tossing and a little bit of a massage on the cutting board. And by the way, my rule of thumb for something like this is 1 teaspoon of kosher salt per pound of meat. And while we'll definitely taste and adjust later, that's going to get us very close to the perfect amount. And then once that's set, we can head to the stove where we have a Dutch oven placed over high heat, in which we've drizzled a little bit of vegetable oil. And what we need to do here is brown this meat very well, which is why I'm going to do it in 2 batches so as not to crowd it. And we want to make sure we don't turn that meat until it has a very nice brown crust on it. Right, whenever we're doing simple recipes like this, that only include a few ingredients, it is absolutely critical that we use the proper techniques. And getting a beautiful brown crust on these pieces of beef is one of those techniques. And if everything's gone according to plan, we should have a beautiful fond on the bottom of our Dutch oven, which as you probably know is all that caramelized goodness created when we brown meat. So like I said, I did that in 2 batches. And once the second side of the second batch is done, we'll turn off the heat and we'll set that beef aside and reserve it until needed. And what we'll do is toss in a chunk of butter and we'll turn our heat back on to medium-high and we will toss in a very generous amount of sliced onions along with another pinch of salt. And we will cook this stirring for about 5 minutes or so, or until the onions soften up and start to turn golden. And once we feel like that's happened, we'll toss in a couple tablespoons of flour, and we will cook that stirring for a couple minutes. And while this amount of flour is really not going to make for a thick sauce, it will add a little bit of body to the broth. And by the time we're done, as you'll see, we should have a perfect, not too thick, not too thin texture. And that's it. Once we've cooked our flour for a few minutes, we will stop and toss in some garlic powder, as well as 1 generous spoon of beef bouillon paste. And then we'll finish up by pouring in the best beef broth, or beef bone broth we can find. And we will give that a stir, and then wait for it to come to a boil, at which point we'll transfer our beef in, along with any accumulated juices. And if you're wondering when we're going to put in all the other ingredients, we're not. Right, this really is a ridiculously simple dish, which, as I'll discuss later, is kind of the secret. But anyway, once our beef is transferred in, we will reduce our heat to low and cover this, and then let it simmer gently for a couple hours, or until the meat is very, very tender, but not quite falling apart. And of course, the exact time will depend on how small you cut your beef. But don't go by time, go by testing. And once we've tested it and determined our beef is tender enough, we'll go ahead and use a slotted spoon, or one of these spider web strainers, and we'll remove the beef to a bowl, since our next step is to boil egg noodles right in this broth. And generally, it's not a great idea to boil beef that's already perfectly cooked. So let's go ahead and turn our heat up to high, and because our noodles are going to absorb a lot of this broth, it's probably not a bad idea to add a little more in. So we'll pour that in and wait for this to come up to a boil on high heat. And once it does, we will add our noodles and give this a stir. And it probably wouldn't be a bad idea to cover this as the noodles cook, but I don't, and I think if you keep stirring, you're going to be fine. And depending on the brand, this is going to take about 7 minutes to cook tender, and it's fine if you go the full time, but when I think this is about 30 seconds away from perfection, what we'll do is add our beef back in and give everything a stir, and then reduce our heat to low. And that's it. Once we have everything stirred together, and we've given that probably still warm beef a minute to heat through, we are definitely going to want to give it a taste, to not just double check our noodles are tender, but since we added some extra broth, we might need to season it up again. But I'm happy to report mine was perfect. So I went ahead and served up. And as far as garnishing goes, my Amish culinary sources tell me a generous sprinkling of freshly ground black pepper is traditional. But I was in kind of a reckless, flamboyant mood, so I also added a few freshly sliced green onions. And that's it. My take on Amish beef and noodles was ready to enjoy. So I went ahead and ladled some up, making sure I was getting plenty of everything. Right, that beautiful beef, those beef broth infused noodles, and of course plenty of that gorgeous broth itself. And after repeating the whole garnishing routine, I went ahead and dug in. And that, my friends, really was heaven. Right, you know me, I love anything beef, and pretty much have a noodle fetish. So there was no way I wasn't going to enjoy this. And I don't know about you, but I always feel like it's a good thing when we think we need a fork and a spoon to fully enjoy a dish. And I think this is definitely one of those dishes. And by the way, if you wanted a slightly thicker version that you could just eat with a fork, all you really have to do is not add that extra broth. But personally, I thought this had the perfect texture. But I always like to mention that kind of thing, since you might enjoy yours a little bit differently. But as comforting and satisfying and flavorful as this really was, it's also for me a very frustrating dish to make, since as you might have noticed, I love throwing lots of things into recipes. But that is not this dish. Right? This dish serves as an important reminder of really how little we need to do to produce something incredibly delicious to eat. And yes, it was very, very difficult not to add cayenne. But of course, if you feel like a few shakes, go ahead. I mean, you are, after all, the commish of this amazing Amish dish. Oh, and before I sign off, there's one thing I have to mention. Apparently, lots of my Amish friends like to serve this on mashed potatoes, which, as you can see, I did not do. Right? Even I have limits. But whether you serve this as shown, or spoon it over some mashed potatoes for some hot carb-on-carb action, this is simple, rustic American food at its finest. And I really do hope you give this a try soon. So please follow the link below for the ingredient amounts, a printable written recipe, and much more info as usual. And as always, enjoy.